We're now less than 1 hour away from Governor Abbott's State of the State address. It's a speech traditionally delivered before lawmakers in Austin. But instead, tonight the governor will speak from a private business about 40 minutes south of the capital city. Governor Abbott will deliver tonight's State of the State from a corporate site in San Marcos, a change-up from the traditional format in which he addresses a joint session of the legislature at the Capitol, something he first deviated from in 2021 due to COVID.
Going, though, to San Marcos is going to be important because we talk about this as going public. He's going to highlight access here or issues about fentanyl and the opioid crisis that are there in Hays County. And also, right, the growth, the people who are moving to Texas and are choosing that county to move to.
Dr. Mark Owens is a political science professor at UT Tyler and says we can expect the governor to highlight the state's success and emergency legislation he hopes to see lawmakers tackle this session.
That means that they get priority in the state legislature when they talk about, what needs to be passed or what's going to move faster in the legislature. That's going to really matter.
Among the people attending tonight's address, Smith County GOP Chair David Stein.
The number one that I'm hearing from everybody, everywhere, is property taxes. There's an enormous surplus, and the number keeps growing. And they're going to do something with property taxes. How much it is, what it is specifically, don't know. Maybe he'll line that particular out.
On the other side of the aisle, Smith County Democratic Chair Hector Garza hopes to hear the governor prioritize gun legislation.
It just seems like every day there's a mass shooting, or every other day there's a mass shooting, and I would really like to see him in this next legislative session reach across the aisle and formulate something to where, Democrats and Republicans can come together and find a solution to this.
Along with the actual talking points, politicos are also waiting to see how the governor's priorities match those outlined by other state leaders.
And right now, the lieutenant governor and governor are all talking about wanting to work together. But this idea of a collective view on where is the legislature going this year is a potential contrast.
You can watch the State of the State address tonight at 7 o'clock using the East Texas Now app for your smartphone or your smart TV. To download the app, if you don't have it already, just open your phone's camera, point it to the screen, and scan that QR code.